Okay, so hello, welcome to the 15th session of the Mulimajamaka reading group. And today we're reading chapter 22, an analysis of the Tathāgata. So this is really cool. So I'm going to read from the intro in the commentary. Tathāgata is an epithet for the Buddha or a Buddha. Chandakirti introduces this chapter by having the opponent object that the causal series of lives must be ultimately real, since otherwise it could be no Tathāgata. The argument is that without such a series, there could be no rebirth, and without rebirth, there could not be the countless lives of practice that are said to be necessary to attain the virtues and the skills of a Buddha. Nāgārjuna's response will be that ultimately there can be no such thing as a Tathāgata. That is, the Buddha will turn out to be just as empty as the psychophysical elements on which he is thought to depend. This will in turn provide an opportunity to revisit the question of eternalism and annihilationism that was discussed in previous chapters. Cool. So that outlines the basic intent of this chapter. But before we go right into the text, Sarga, can you help me actually break down the term Tathāgata? Because I think that would be pretty interesting.
Well, there's a lot of random ways that it gets broken down, but the way the Buddha broke it down in the sutras is that he's called the Tathāgata. Here the Tatha is meaning like thus or in such a fashion. That's what Tatha means. It's like an indeclinable. It means like in that fashion. And the way the Buddha uses it is gata here is like the past passive participle of gum. So go. So here it's being used like gone to. Gone to that manner. He uses it like this. He says, because whatever I say, that's exactly how it is. I'm called the Tathāgata. Or because whatever can be attained by the mind or cognized by the mind, all that is fully understood by me. That's why I'm called the Tathāgata. So gata here is like gone to the truth, which means two things: having comprehended it and always speaking it, is what it seems like in a lot of sutras. It seems the Buddha means by Tathāgata. But then commentators have a gazillion different like subtler meanings of this or whatever. But the main meaning that the Buddha gives in sutras, as far as I have seen, is that he speaks the truth always, and he knows the truth always. So he's the Tathāgata.
I see. I've encountered interesting discussions on this term, referring to the kind of ambiguity in the gata part, which almost gives you contradictory senses, either coming or going. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, this is just because you could read it as gata or agata, because either way, when you make the compound word, it would be Tathāgata. Whether it's Tata plus Gata or Tata plus Agata, it's going to be Tathāgata either way. So you could read it as Agata, which means has come. You know, whatever which means come, as in the past passive participle of come, just like gone is the past passive participle of go. So yes, that is true, but that can also, I mean, in English too, we could say, you could retranslate what I just said, because just as I say it, so it is. I am the one who has come to Tata, meaning thus as it is. So just as I say it, so it is. I have come to the way that it is.
Is there any way we can say that the gone part could also be, instead of just like gone to the truth, how about like gone away from ignorance? I mean, is that saying the same thing?
I think it would be saying the same thing if ignorance is just lacking knowledge of the truth. So It would just be the reverse direction.
Yeah, because so I'm not sure if this is canonical or not, but this is like an interesting line of thought I had, particularly thinking about the Buddha's use of wordplay, which is something that I've noticed, and especially with his borrowing of colloquial terms and elevating them to a higher level, or taking socially so words associated with hierarchy and nobility and reinterpreting it. So he's very interested. He's very like playful in that sense. So I'm wondering if the ambiguity is intentional to
Yeah.
put forth a sort of almost like a koan in a weird way, in the sense that it's sort of like, so coming and going are almost like opposite senses, but if you can instantiate both at the same time in a way that says something about the nature of the awakened mind, in the sense that it doesn't really come or go anywhere. But at the same time, he can playfully say that I have come to the truth and I've gone away from ignorance, as a kind of like directional metaphor. But the paradoxical coupling of the two in the same term. What is that called when a word has like two senses at the same time?
I don't know.
I mean, I know a phrase could be a double entendre, but I'm not sure if like a word could be that. But anyway, you get what I mean. So
Yeah.
that's like an interesting line of
Yeah,
thought
it
I
could be
had.
deliberate. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah,
Very well
because instead of thinking it's like one or the other, maybe it's like both, and it almost even in a sense points to the unity of nirvana and samsara. In a sense, it's like gone from samsara, coming to nirvana. But at the same time, because they're sort of indistinguishable in the term, they're probably indistinguishable in reality, which is exactly what the Buddha, Nāgārjuna, points out in some of the parts of his analysis in this text. Cool. So that was cool the discussion. So let's move on to the verses. Okay, verse 1. The Tathāgata is neither identical with the skandhas nor distinct from the skandhas. The skandhas are not in him, nor is he in them. He does not exist possessing the skandhas. What Tathāgata then is there? So this refers to the fivefold examination, or I've also seen it called the fivefold analysis, that we've seen in two different places already in the text. And the commentary basically, Siddhars and Katsura basically sort of reduce it to basically the relationship between X and Y. Two different things are being analyzed with this method of analysis in 5 different ways. And the idea is that these 5 different ways are supposed to be completely exhaustive of the different forms of relations that these two variables can have. And for Nāgārjuna's case, what he tends to do is basically go through each of the different levels of the 5-4 analysis to show how his object of inquiry does not stand up to scrutiny in any of the 5 ways, which allows us to conclude that these are ultimately unreal. So just to list out in the purely abstract form, in a relationship between X and Y, we can analyze it as where either X and Y is identical to each other, X and Y is distinct from each other, X is in Y in some sense, or Y is in X in some sense, or one is in possession of the other. So this is basically how the scheme goes. And I think that the first major way that we actually encountered this was in the analysis of fire and fuel, which is really interesting and important chapter where a lot of these kinds of repetitive analyses show up. I think fire and fuel also had the 3 times argument somewhere in it as well. So anyway, in this context, we have to situate it in the relationship between the Tathāgata and the skandhas. So the skandhas being the psychophysical elements that constitutes the basis upon which a person or a Tathāgata, a being, would be imputed upon. So if the Tathāgata is identical with the skandhas, so typically the way I like to sort of break this down is that with each part of the analysis, I'll call it a limb, with each limb of the analysis, there is a consequence for believing in the validity of the relation. And then there's a reason to refute the validity of this limb in applying to the relationship we're analyzing because of the consequence. So in this case, the consequence of saying that x and y are identical, in this case, the Tathāgata and the skandhas, is that the agent and object become one. So in this case, the Tathāgata, the one who takes up the skandhas, the agent, and the skandhas, the object which is being taken up. If we're saying that they're identical, they're basically one. But the reason to refute this is that if agent and object are one, it's be impossible for us to actually distinguish them in the first place. And if we can't distinguish them in the first place, there's no way to ask the relationship between the two, which presupposes that we're able to meaningfully distinguish them. So in this case, we can refute the idea that the Tathāgata is identical with the skandha. So now we move on to the next one. Is the Tathāgata distinct from the skandhas? And the consequence of this is that the Tathāgata and the skandhas necessarily exist in a relationship of mutual independence. So in order to be distinct, they can exist in principle independently of each other. But then the reason to refute this is that it makes the relationship superfluous and not essentially necessary. So in this sense, you're saying that sort of like the relationship between a seed and a sprout. If we say that a seed and a sprout are distinct and mutually independent, then it makes the causal relationship from which a seed gives rise to a sprout kind of meaningless because we already have the sprout co-present with the seed. In this case, the relationship between the Tathāgata and the skandhas would be entirely superfluous because the Tathāgata would exist whether or not the skandhas are there, and vice versa. So because of that, because it makes relations between the two superfluous, but we're actually trying to ground a relation, we can refute this limb and then move on to the next one. So sometimes the order is changed up depending on who is outlining it or where it's being outlined, but that doesn't really matter as much as it does just exhausting all 5 elements or 5 limbs. So the third one I wrote is that X is in Y. So the text says the skandhas are not in him, nor is he in them. So these are actually kind of, in a way, simple. A relationship in which X is in Y or Y is in X, and that, in order for that to hold, we have to presuppose that they are mutually independent from one another. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to say that one is in another. They have to be somewhat distinct for one to, for the relationship to hold. So in a way, we can treat this, both 3 and 4, this in relation, in the same way that we would treat the distinct relation. And since we've already refuted that, we can now refute 3 and 4. For the 5th and final fold of the analysis, the relationship of possession in which one possesses the other, this one sort of almost oscillates or is in an indeterminate position with regards to identity and difference. So what I mean by that is that when you say that one possesses the other, you're either positing a kind of something like an identity relation or something like a difference relation. So for example, if you say that the Tathāgata possesses the skandhas, you're either saying that the skandhas basically are a part of him and as part of his own identity, or you're saying that it's something different from him. So so this again is not very different from the first 2 parts of the 5-fold analysis. So for the same reasons, we can refute this limb because it basically borrows the same consequences and reasons to refute as the first 2. So in the very end, so in a way, it seems like actually what you really need is the first 2, an analysis of identity and difference. because that's the sort of the core element of the other three as well. But I guess in order to be exhaustive of all the different combinations of relations that you can conceive of, we're just exhaustive, for the sake of thoroughness. So now that we have not established the relation between the Tathāgata and the skandhas in any of the fivefold ways, then we cannot say that there is a Tathāgata who depends upon the skandhas or has a relation with the skandhas. And that's the first major conclusion. And pretty much, I think it would be exhaustive for the final conclusion as well. But for the sake of thoroughness, we'll continue to all the different reasons for why the Tathāgata is not ultimately real. Do either of you have any comments on that? That was a whole bunch, but it's a very juicy, I think, technique or mode of analysis. A very thorough, I think.
Yeah, I agree. It's very it teases out all the possibilities.
Okay, so let's move on to verse 2. If the Buddha is dependent on the skandhas, then he does not exist intrinsically. How can someone who does not exist intrinsically exist extrinsically? Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, I'll just read from the commentary. Given the failure of the fivefold examination to turn up an ultimately real Buddha, one might suppose that the Tathāgata is named and conceptualized on the basis of the 5 skandhas. But to say this is to say that the Buddha lacks intrinsic nature and so fails to exist ultimately. Given this, one cannot claim that the Tathāgata exists dependent on other things that do have an intrinsic nature. The reason is given in the next verse. So yeah, so 2 and 3 in a way definitely come together. So I'll read 3 as well. It is possible that one who is dependent on extrinsic nature is without an essence. But how will one who is devoid of essence become the Tathāgata? So for verse 2, the sense I got is that without something having an intrinsic existence or intrinsic nature, there's no basis from which we can actually differentiate it from something else to constitute it as something, so constitute this thing as having extrinsic nature. So if something doesn't intrinsically exist, we can't differentiate it from something else to say that it has an extrinsic nature. Yeah, so, and this is, I think, important because, especially for Madhyamikas and understanding it, when we deny intrinsic existence, we're not in turn proposing extrinsic existence in its place. It's more thoroughgoing than that. So to be more thoroughgoing, once we deny intrinsic existence, there is not even a thing to exist intrinsically to constitute a relation of extrinsic, to constitute an extrinsic relation that that thing has with something else. Yeah, so, and with regards to verse 3, it is possible that one who is dependent on extrinsic nature is without an essence, but how will one who is devoid of essence become the Tathāgata? So what I got from this is that that for something to depend extrinsically and to be without essence, so basically say that it lacks intrinsic nature. But something that lacks something or someone who lacks intrinsic nature cannot be the Tathāgata simply because simply because no one doesn't become someone else, right? So if someone doesn't exist intrinsically, it doesn't make sense to say that that person becomes anyone else, let alone the Tathāgata. So this seems to undermine the possibility that someone could become the Tathāgata, which is that because that is something that we understand conventionally as a Tathāgata, is that the Buddha who was a Tathāgata at some point was not a Buddha. So it was a person who became the Tathāgata. But here we're establishing that if the person is devoid of essence, how can they become the Tathāgata? Verse 4, and if there is no intrinsic nature, how will there be an extrinsic nature? Besides intrinsic and extrinsic nature, what Tathāgata is there? So this basically establishes that intrinsic nature and extrinsic nature are mutually entailing concepts, and as well as being exhaustive of all the different kinds of natures. So if the Tathāgata cannot be established as either intrinsically or extrinsically existent, then we can't say it exists at all. Now the commentary says that according to Bhavavika, his commentary, that at this point we're sort of assuming that our interlocutor has shifted to a sort of Pudgalavadan position in which we can accept that the Tathāgata is neither identical nor distinct from the skandhas, yet somehow exists in a mystical, inexpressible way. So in a sense, it somehow exists independently of these skandhas, thus being ultimately real. Oh, and then I think that the key thing here is the idea that even if the Tathāgata has a relationship to the skandhas, conceptualized independence, still the Tathāgata has an element that is beyond expressibility in terms of identity or difference, and thus exists ultimately in that way. That idea is now being refuted with the following verses. So verse 5. If there was some Tathāgata not dependent on the skandhas, then he could attain dependence on the skandhas, thus he would be dependent. So this is sort of setting up what this hypothetical opponent would be saying. By but proposing the idea that there's a Tathāgata independent of the skandhas, who can then come into a relationship of dependence. And then 6 will refute this following. But there is no Tathāgata whatsoever without dependence on the skandhas. And how will one who does not exist without dependence come to depend on them? So an independent Tathāgata cannot be found. And so if an independent Tathāgata cannot be found, then an independent Tathāgata who becomes dependent cannot also be found. So in here it's just sort of asserting it and assuming that we will just accept the reasoning that there's no Tathāgata whatsoever without dependence on the skandhas. But I guess a quick way to sort of deal with that is that the skandhas are pretty much exhaustive of all the different elements of experience. And so if something does not exist in dependence on the skandhas, then simply speaking, it doesn't exist because there's nothing outside of the skandhas. So the Tathāgata cannot exist outside of the skandhas because there's nothing other than the skandhas in our sense experience. So verse 7, something cannot be what is dependent upon without having been depended upon by someone. Nor can it be that the Tathāgata somehow exists devoid of what he depends on. So what I got from this is that this also establishes a relationship of mutual dependence, this time between the dependent and the depender. So
I think it's weird though that the Akuto Bhaya and Buddhapalita both explain this as like not being, as there being an impossibility of prior and posterior with respect to the skandhas and the Tathāgata. I thought it just means like the Tathāgata can't be independently existent if we're taking him to have this connection to the skandhas, but also it can't be that we take the Tathāgata to be dependent upon the skandhas because, oh, well, I guess maybe their version of it does make sense, because then the Tathāgata, then the skandhas would exist prior to the Tathāgata.
Right. If the
right.
If the I guess like between the dependent and the depender, if there's like a process of depending, then within that process of depending, the dependent would have to have existed prior to the depender for the depender to then get into the process of depending. Because the Let's see. Oh, and this makes me think. So this particular explanation based on the beginninglessness of samsara is clearly not immediately evident by the literal text of the verses, and this this makes me think and wonder a little bit about the sort of oral transmission of the meaning of an explanation of this text traditionally, and didn't that start with Nāgārjuna and his student Aryadeva? This sort of more extensive oral exposition or explanation of the verses, which are succinct and terse for memorization.
The Akuto Bhaya says that it is the original lecture explanation on the verses. And presumably Aryadeva did get an explanation of these verses. How close his explanation would have been to the Akuto Bhaya, I mean, I don't know if we know. But
the Akuto Bhaya, we don't know who actually wrote it, right?
The Akuto Bhaya claims that it self-consciously claims to be Nāgārjuna's explanation.
Oh, like his auto commentary?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
And also, I think later commentators seem to believe that it was. So,
interesting. Oh, yeah, that's good to know. Let's see. Where were we? Oh, yes, verse 7. Yeah, so I think it'd be good to actually read the commentary because it is an extensive explanation. The Putabhaya and the Buddhapalita explain the argument as being based on the beginninglessness of samsara. For there to be the relation of dependence, there must be that which is dependent and that on which it depends. In the present case, what is dependent would be the Tathāgata, and what is dependent on is the skandha. But because the round of rebirths in samsara is without beginning, there cannot be the relation of prior and posterior between the skandhas and the Tathāgata that is required for the relation to hold. There is no moment in the past about which we could say that before that moment there were skandhas, but no Tathāgata. For if samsara is beginningless, then there is no first birth of the Tathāgata. And in order for the Tathāgata to be dependent on the skandhas must be prior to the Tathāgata. Let's see. Oh, and I think the following is actually pretty important here too. The term that is here and in the next three verses translated as what is depended on is upadana, which was translated earlier as appropriation. Both here and elsewhere, upadana refers to the skandhas and dependence on which a person is named and conceptualized. Unenlightened beings, however, identify with those skandhas that serve as the grounds of their sense of I, and this identifying can also be called appropriating. Presumably, the Tathāgata, and as an enlightened being, does not identify with those skandhas and dependence on which he is named and conceptualized. So it may be inappropriate to call those skandhas associated with the Tathāgata an appropriation. This is why we have chosen to use a more neutral what is dependent on in this chapter. So I just thought that last part is important because I was also a little confused. I was like, well, of course the Tathāgata is not appropriating the skandhas, which is what I thought what it meant to be dependent on the skandhas. But I guess I can see here that this almost actually points to, I think, the sort of later conclusion of this chapter is that the Tathāgata is actually an imputation. So the Tathāgata is an imputation by sentient beings on the skandhas, rather than a Tathāgata being an agent who appropriates their own skandhas, right? But let's see. Yeah, so if this mutual relationship of dependence required, if there's a temporal dimension to it, where the dependent had to exist prior to the depender, but if samsara, so in a way, this actually says that there can be the conventional distinction between dependent and depender that we can actually sort of articulate as happening successively as a series of mutually co-arising phenomena. But there's never a point at which the chain actually stops at one of them to actually sort of ground the whole relation, right? So there's no point at which the Tathāgata. I mean, this is kind of a little confusing to also think about, because I mean, I guess that's the point, to not really think about it in the way I guess I was trying to. Yeah. So I guess, like, even if we can say that there is a series of the phenomena in which one arises in succession after the other, and that they both hold a relationship of mutual dependence, yeah, and if, because samsara is beginningless, I'm just repeating myself. There's there's no point at which one end of the relationship starts before the other one. Okay, verse 8. Being something that does not exist as either identical with or distinct from the skandhas when investigated in any of the 5 ways mentioned in verse 1 of this chapter, how is the Tathāgata conceptualized by means of what he depends on? So this basically sort of points back to verse 1 by saying, if the Tathāgata is unestablished by the 5-fold analysis, then how can we conceptualize the Tathāgata at all as in terms of the skandhas? Yeah, so the commentary states, no real Tathāgata has been found by considering the 5 ways in which he might stand in relation to what is real, the skandhas. Nor is there any other way in which such a being might be found. Hence, it makes no sense to speak of a real Tathāgata. Let's see. Okay, verse 9. So now we get a little bit more, we get a little deeper into the analysis by analyzing how the Tathāgata doesn't ultimately exist, not only on its own, but also because the things that which it ostensibly depends upon also does not exist intrinsically. So verse 9, moreover, that on which he depends does not exist by virtue of intrinsic nature. And how can what does not exist intrinsically exist extrinsically? So so here we're sort of presupposing, which is not an unfounded assumption, but follows from previous analysis of the skandhas, that the skandhas are empty and dependently originated, and hence without intrinsic nature. But being without intrinsic nature, they cannot be, they cannot bear the nature, they cannot bear an extrinsic nature to something else, because we've previously established in verse 4 that intrinsic and extrinsic natures are mutually entailing. Yeah, and so now following verse 10, thus both that on which he depends and the one who is dependent are altogether empty. And how is an empty Tathāgata to be conceptualized by means of something empty? So if we just establish that the skandhas are empty and the Tathāgatas are empty, then it makes no sense to say that an empty Tathāgata has this relationship with empty skandhas. It basically is meaningless. Because a relationship between unreal things is senseless, or just not even senseless. It doesn't mean anything. Verse 11. So verse 11 is a key verse, and I think it's really important, of course, to understanding the nature of the teaching of emptiness, the doctrine of emptiness, and its actual functional use. So I'll read it, and then I think I'll actually read the whole commentary because it's nice and extensive. 11. It is empty is not to be said, nor it is non-empty, nor that it is both, nor that it is neither. Empty is said only for the sake of instruction. So the commentary says, when a Madhyamika says that things are empty, this is not to be understood as stating the ultimate truth about the ultimate nature of reality. Instead, this is just a useful pedagogical device, a way of instructing others who happen to believe that there is such a thing as the ultimate truth about the ultimate nature of reality. So the claim made here is in effect the same as the claim Nāgārjuna would make in chapter 24, verse 18, that emptiness itself is empty. Here as elsewhere, Nāgārjuna employs a device known as the tetralemma, or kachuskoti, to express his point. He considers all four possible views concerning emptiness, only to reject them all. But as Bhavabhika reminds us, and as Chandrakirti pointed out in previous comments, when the Buddha rejects all four possibilities with respect to such questions as whether the world is eternal, this is because, while each may prove useful for certain purposes under certain circumstances, all share a presupposition that is false. Chandrakirti suggests that what we have here is another possible instance of a graded teaching, which with each of the four possibilities representing a view held by certain philosophers. Interestingly, Chandrakirti identifies the view that there are both empty and non-empty things with the Sautrantika, since they hold that all present things are ultimately real, and the view that things are neither empty nor non-empty with Yogacara, since they hold that reality is inexpressible. Bhavabhika considers the following objection.
Interesting. So Chandrakirti basically thinks that Yogacharans are actually making the assertion things are neither empty nor non-empty, rather than taking them to be like him, which is to be refusing to make the assertion that things are empty and refusing to make the assertion that things are non-empty. He shuffles the negations around. His position is the Yogacara position, just with the negations shuffled a little bit to make them interlocutionary, instead of being like what he takes to be the, I guess, literal nature of the negations in Yogacara, which is kind of strange, because I feel like maybe Yogacarans, well, maybe some Yogacarans would say, yeah, that does express our position, but others might say, no, our position is the same as yours. We neither assert that everything is empty, nor do we assert that everything is non-empty. So you should rearrange this sentence to be, therefore, neither to be empty nor to be non-empty is said of all things, instead of therefore all is said to be neither empty or non-empty. Well, I don't know.
Well, the way I kind of see here is that my sense from Yogacara, which one of my some sort of, I don't know, interesting thing I noticed, which that I was sort of struggling to really accept in a way, is a sense that I thought that Yogacara understanding of the illusory nature of things posits them as actual illusions. And I think this is subtly different from the Madhyamaka mode to see things as illusion-like, which is that the only way that they can appear is as illusions, but because they lack intrinsic nature, they don't actually exist to even be illusions, right? Whereas I think the Yogacara has a much more positive and forceful and strong view that the phenomenal appearances are real illusions that are projections of the mind. And even if Yogacara might say, a Yogacaran might say, all things are reducible to projections of the mind, but then mind is also empty. Even if that second move is made, there's a sense in which the phenomena and even the mind are real illusions. And I think this subtle aspect of positing reality, even ironically, as the unreality of things, like the real unreality of things, ends up being a positive proposition equivalent to saying that things are neither empty nor not empty. That's the sort of sense I get there. Yeah, and I think, and I might bring this up a little later too, because it's very pertinent to this chapter, which is me trying to continue to refine my sort of idea that Buddhas are mere hypothetizations in a way that avoids the same Yogacara problem. You know, hypothetizations cannot be real, right? So in a way, the saying Buddhas are mere hypothetizations is not to say that they're actual holograms, but that that's the only way that they may appear. to us, and that this appearance is a diluted appearance. But anyway, it's a slight digression there. So yeah, so what's one of the interesting things? Oh, and before I go there, I guess like, what about empty and non-empty? What would be good examples of traditions in Buddhism that posit that? I know that there are some early schools that posit the reality of.
With the thing about Tathāgata being like things are either empty or not empty, it could be, as Chandrakirti explains it, it's like the time thing, where the Tathāgata thinks that presently existent dharmas are non-empty and do have an intrinsic nature, but go out of existence momentarily, and so then cease. So they are non-empty, but then any conception of them that is time delayed is just an empty projection. So under the Tathāgata view, because there's a time delay between a thing going out of existence and us, say, seeing that thing, where we see that thing after it's gone out of existence, our visual perception of it occurs at a time when it no longer exists. So what we see is just an empty projection that is dependently arisen, dependent upon that, but not actually that thing that we think we're seeing. Whereas when that thing did exist, or I guess like right now, what does exist is some set of presently existent dharmas that are non-empty, but none of the things that we see are as they appear to be on the Tathāgata view. So I think that's why Chandrakirti says they say some things are empty and other things aren't empty.
Yeah, that makes sense. And almost in the sense that there are some things that are real and some things are not. Isn't there a school? Is it the I might pretty much. Is it the Vaibhashikas who think that all three times are real? Yeah. So they might be. They might be like the non-empty view, or we could. And I mean, this is just a schematization, right? It's not saying that they are this or that, but that. If we can extend Chandrakirti's scheme there, I guess the Vaibhashikas could be the non-empties. Then the empty would be what? Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, that's an interesting exercise, but we can keep moving on. Okay, first, oh, actually, no, before I do that, I was going to comment that there's almost two things happening here in verse 11, which the commentary obviously points to, but I want to tease out a little bit, which is that even though it comes in the form of saying, don't say this about emptiness, there's also like a positive element here, which it refers to the idea of a graded teaching. And I like the idea that there's almost like this positive and negative polarity happening within this whole verse, and the negative part being the sort of tetralemical negation of each different understanding of emptiness. And the purpose of this is to eliminate false views about emptiness. Yet, in the manner of doing that, we're also in a way sort of preserving. I'm not sure if tetralemical would be appropriate here, because lemma is like dilemma. Lemma is like problem, right? I don't know, forgive me for being sloppy here, but maybe like tetra-technical or something. A fourfold way of being productive, which is propositions about emptiness purely for the purpose of instruction on right view. So you have this sort of tetralemical negation of the different modes of emptiness for the purpose of eliminating false views on emptiness. And then sort of tetra-technical proposition for the purpose of instruction on cultivating views, right views on emptiness. So these two different aspects. Yeah. And with the key factor that the last limb is not something to remain on, but also remains something different. verse 12. How can it is eternal, it is not eternal, and the rest of this tetralemma apply to the Tathāgata, who is free of intrinsic nature? And how can it has an end, it does not have an end, and the rest of this tetralemma apply to the Tathāgata, who is free of intrinsic nature? So I think this is pretty simple. It's almost basically asking, you can't ask any of these tetralemical questions of the Tathāgata, whether it's eternal, or if it has an end, or if it persists after cessation, etc. None of them apply simply because the Tathāgata has no intrinsic nature. There's no thing there to apply in the way that these questions pose the Tathāgata to exist. So in a way, you can kind of say that here is like Nāgārjuna's sort of elaborate explanation of the reasoning that's often implicit in a lot of the suttas based on these sort of questions. Can you hear my cat screaming? Okay, let me let her in, otherwise she's gonna keep screaming forever. Okay, verse 13. But one who has taken up a mass of beliefs, such as that the Tathāgata exists, so conceptualizing, the person will also imagine the Tathāgata does not exist when extinguished. So yeah, this basically says that someone who thinks that the Tathāgata exists when they are present and seemingly alive, when they pass into nirvana, particularly parinirvana, bodily death, we'd also think that they're extinguished, that they actually do get annihilated. 14, and the thought does not hold with reference to the Tathāgata who is intrinsically empty. Sorry, I just lost myself there. And the thought does not hold with reference to the Tathāgata who is intrinsically empty, that the Buddha either exists or does not exist after cessation. Yeah, but this view of genuine extinction or annihilation after cessation is false because, according to the commentary, the cessation entails the cessation of any basis to posit something happening or not happening. So to think that cessation entails something being completely extinguished is to misunderstand the nature of cessation, the cessation of the Tathāgata. 15.
Also, in a sense, there is no ultimately existent Tathāgata to pass into parinirvana. But an ultimate cessation doesn't even occur.
Right. 15. Those who hypothesize that the Buddha, who is beyond hypothesization and unwavering, they all, deceived by hypothesization, fail to see the Tathāgata. And I like the commentary here. Chandakirti explains that the Buddha is said to be unwavering inasmuch as, being by nature empty and so unarisen, the Buddha is not the sort of thing that could undergo change. Only an ultimately existing Buddha could be the sort of thing for which the question of change could arise. We should go right to 16. Let's go to 16 and then I have like a little question or a concern. 16. What is the intrinsic nature of the Tathāgata? That is the intrinsic nature of the world. The Tathāgata is devoid of intrinsic nature. This world is devoid of intrinsic nature. And I think this basically sort of spells out the same relation in verse 10, that the Tathāgata and the skandhas are empty. Because if the skandhas are sort of exhaustive of the nature of experience, they're also sort of what constitutes the world. Not necessarily a set of skandhas for a particular being, but any possible set of skandhas. At the very basic level, even inert and sentient phenomena are composed of elemental particles, which are constitutive of the rupa skandha. I'm pretty sure. So basically everything within experience is assumable within the skandhas. So to say that the Tathāgata and the skandhas are both empty is also very similar to saying that the Tathāgata and the world are both similarly devoid of intrinsic nature.
And then it kind of is also reminiscent then of the thing like the commentaries about like being a magical illusion, but then the thing that there's like a commentary on Chandrakirti's Madhyamakavatara, where the commentator, it's like a Kagyu commentary, it's by one of the Karmapas, I think maybe the third Karmapa, I don't know, where he says that things are like a magical illusion, but they're not just like a magical illusion. They're like if you had a magical illusion that was itself conjured by a magician who is also a magical illusion. And so it's like that, right? The
yeah, I mean, I think that sort of relates to what I was saying, kind of like, yes, illusory, but not actually. You know, even the illusion is an illusion.
Well, it is illusory, and whatever
Right.
the basis for the illusion, that is the basis onto which you are mistakenly superimposing this illusion, is also just an illusion.
Yeah, it almost makes me sometimes think about how, in a way, phenomena are just kind of like the stirring, the traces of the stirring of the mind, which has no essential content, but because you're fixated on the traces, you can sort of delude yourself into thinking that there's something there, something you see, and a basis upon which the things you see are, you know, projected on. But really what it is a trace of the mind's own knowing capacity, which has no actual content, because that's what that knowing faculty is.
That's what I've been saying with the VR headset that's turned on, but there's no phenomenal content in the VR headset. That's exactly what I meant to.
Yeah.
You explained it better. I have a weird analogy. You just put it simply.
No, but now that I think about it, now that makes your analogy makes more sense to me now. But yeah, something about I mean, this is the sort of cosmogony almost problem of like delusion and samsara, is like, what is this stirring? And from what I get vaguely from the sort of Dzogchen cosmology is that this stirring is the residual karmic traces from the previous universe of beings who attained Buddhahood at the end of the universe, but haven't actually exhausted their karma properly. And so that trace element of the karma sort of still transitions into the next universe at the very beginning of the neutral basis. And this stirring is what sort of basically causes a bifurcation of samsara and nirvana. And I guess if this cyclical cosmology is the beginningless series, beginningless series of samsara, I guess, yeah, in a way, there's always delusion of some degree along with awakening. In a way, it's like this, it's like sort of this ironic thing where it's like, as long as sentient beings, exist, there will be Buddhas to exist who save them. And as long as there are Buddhas to exist, there are sentient beings saving them. What if, like, at the end of the universe, if there's always that residual karmic trace that moves into the next universe, then in a way, there's always going to be sentient beings and Buddhas. But I don't know, but now this is starting getting a little speculative, and I don't have scripture to back it up. But the comment I was going to make before we end here is that, and I might be just reading too much in this English translation, which is always going to be terrible. But I noticed in verse 15, there's almost a subtle distinction between hypostatizing the Buddha and being deceived by hypostatization. So is hypostatizing itself constituted of delusion necessarily? Or is it possible that delusion comes after some aspect of hypostatization? Is what I'm trying to figure out. It's like, is hypostatization necessarily deceptive by nature? Or is it possible to hypostatize without deceiving, without being deceived? And I guess this might relate back to our previous discussion on the bodhisattva's awareness as a kind of as if awareness of like things exist as if they existed, but I know that they don't, kind of thing.
I'm skeptical of this.
Yeah. So yeah, okay. Because I almost kind of see, like, if the Buddha appears in the, if someone who is ostensibly, if someone is clearly can be conventionally designated as a Buddha. An enlightened awareness can recognize that appearance as something that sentient beings may impute a Buddhahood onto. So they may be able to see what could be the case for sentient beings, yet they don't do what sentient beings do.
But what could be the case for sentient beings is not real.
Right.
So
sure.
And it's also
So
not
it can't
even
be
real. It's also not even real, as we were just saying. It's not even real. Okay, you have to, right? When we say this is empty, thus it's not actually real, it just seems to be real. But then we say, oh, but then we go and we keep doing the emptiness. Even the it seeming to be real isn't real. It just seems to seem to be real. Right? That's the emptiness of emptiness. So if even the seeming to be real, which characterizes sentient beings, itself also only seems to be real, how can you have enlightened awareness that also contains, I just don't know how you would have it also contain whatever it is that sentient beings experience.
Well, I think perhaps it's more of a kind of, not an actual seeing, but an intimate knowledge of the possibility for such appearances to become distorted within the mind of within an ignorant mind, but not truly seeing what the ignorant being is seeing, but knowing intimately that the sentient beings, if they were there, would see it this way.
That would still involve hypostatizing sentient beings into existence. But the Buddha, the Prajnaparamita Sutras say that the Bodhisattva doesn't even see sentient beings. Bodhisattva has great compassion because they swear to set all beings free, all the while knowing there are no sentient beings.
Interesting. This is interesting. This is an interesting, like, funny thing with the logical conclusion of like a lot of this Mahayana view, which is that absolute altruism kind of becomes a kind of like complete like self-interest as well, in a way.
Well, but self-interest is also not real. So
it's not. I'm saying ultimately neither of them actually apply. But there's this sort of funny thing happening here where it's like, I will save all sentient beings, but also all sentient beings are mere displays in my mind, and expressions of my own nature, basically. I mean, they won't say that, but the practical instruction comes in that form. But no, I like the. This is a difficult line of inquiry for me to figure out, because the distinction I've been sort of making is that hypothesization is distinct from reification. That reification is what not necessarily, but almost necessarily follows from hypothesization. If the mind which hypothesizes doesn't recognize the hypothesization as a hypothesization, it ends up going to the next moment of reification. And then I was thinking, can there be a possibility of an awakened mind which has the initial moment of hypothesization without necessarily doing what a sentient being would do, which is to subsequently reify the hypothesizations? And I guess the way I can analogize this is as if, like, okay, seeing the display in a VR headset could look really real, but having the knowledge that you have a headset on, you will see the appearances and the diversity in which they exist, but you'll never be convinced that they're actually real.
Whereas you'll still be convinced that their seeming to be real is real. That is, even though you'll not be convinced that there are actually such objects, you will still be convinced that there is the appearance of such an object. But the Madhyamaka analysis, under the Madhyamaka analysis, even the appearance of things is empty. Even the illusion is an illusion.
Sure, but this doesn't mean that they're annihilated, right? That they're refuted. It just qualifies their existence.
I don't know if it's really about qualifying their existence. I think it's about refuting their existence, not qualifying them.
I mean, what if it's I mean, it's funny. It's like it's oscillation I do sometimes between a kind of Gelug approach and a more thoroughgoing, maybe Sakya Nyingma approach, which is like qualifying negation versus thoroughgoing negation. It's like, anyway, interesting conversation, a lot to think about, and hopefully some of these questions will be more elucidated in the following chapters, particularly the next chapter, which is analysis of false conception. So perhaps that will help. It's been a while since I actually read the whole thing, so I forget what this chapter is about. But yeah, so I think this is, extensive enough that we can just focus on chapter 23 for the next meeting. And then,
yeah, sounds good.
And then we have 3 more meetings basically, and then we'll conclude.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thank you guys, and see you next week.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.